The Hong Kong Institute of Chartered Secretaries recently held its biennial Corporate Governance Conference. In Session 1 of the conference, the speakers were asked to give their views on the role of directors. Which do they resemble most? Guard dogs, police dogs, or lap dogs? The first speaker to respond to this question is Mr Antony Leung Kam-chung, Group Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Fung Group.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to share with you my experience as the director, and kind of gave me the topic, what should be the role of a director, whether we should be a guard dog, police dog, or lap dog. But throughout the many directorships that I held and am still holding, depending on the organization and the amount of work that they somehow impose on us, and also the kinds of material that they prepare, a lot of times I actually do not feel that I'm any of that three categories. I just felt that I work like a dog. Many of those organizations would just kind of give us piles and piles of papers just the day before the meeting. And maybe that is kind of how they manage the directors, particularly the so-called more troublesome ones like myself, just throw us with a lot of information that they believe that we would not be able to digest. I believe I've been asked because I did serve on quite a number of boards, Airport Authority being one, but the first significant board that I served on was actually on the Hong Kong Futures Exchange almost 30 years ago. Now, for those of you that may not actually have born by then, we did have a futures exchange before it was merged with the stock exchange. And maybe, again, it was because of me. Soon after I joined, we had the kind of major financial meltdown in Hong Kong as well as in the world, resulting in actually almost the bankruptcy of the futures exchange. And then it got merged into the stock exchange. So I had quite a bit of experience in serving on boards of statutory bodies, but also I've served on many other boards. Obviously, I'm kind of chairman of the board of Fung, but besides working as executive directors of companies, I also work in a number of organizations as independent directors, including the ICBC, and we saw the IPO of that particular bank. I was on the board of AIA and now serving on the board of China Commercial Bank. But besides the larger organizations, I also have served on smaller organizations. I'm still on a US board of a pharmaceutical company, a small one, unlisted. And I also work in a non-profit organization. Right now, I'm chairman of Heifer International in Hong Kong as well as Food Angel. So I say all this because just to kind of give you a sense that I have served as board members of many organizations from public to private ones, from executive directors to independent directors, and also the kind of on various kinds of institutions, financial services, property companies, and also in kind of startups. I'm actually chairman of a startup that we're working on called New Frontier. So when I kind of look at the question, whether directors are guard dogs, police dogs, or lap dogs, my answer is it really depends on the situation. Obviously, corporate governance, a lot of times when you look at Google, we no longer say when you look at the dictionary, we always say when you look at Google. It talks about how do you balance the interests of the various stakeholders. That obviously would be very important when we are talking about major corporate events, such as mergers and acquisitions, such as going public, such as actually the deciding on dividends, so on and so forth. And in those cases, a lot of times we have to be guard dogs to make sure that all the stakeholders' interests are being protected and protected fairly. But those will not be kind of daily event, even though at times in some of those organizations that I mentioned, it's not easy to be so-called maintaining an absolutely fair situation. The reason why I said it is in many of those organizations, particularly those in the mainland, particularly those that are state-owned, you have to kind of take into account not just the conventional interests of being the shareholders or the minority shareholders or the say, customers or the employees. You have to also take into account the interests of the state. And sometimes balancing those interests would be extremely difficult. For those of you that have served on mainland boards, particularly in state-owned companies, sometimes it is rather difficult, and particularly in many of those instances where the boards on paper would have the authority to kind of do practically all kinds of things. But you know that replacing a CEO in a state-owned organization is very difficult, and it's almost always not really the decision of the board. So sometimes balancing the interests of the various stakeholders would be difficult in those situations. But besides balancing the interests of the various shareholders, I usually would actually spend more time in making sure that the organization develops and grows in line with the interests of the various stakeholders, particularly how to take the company forward, how to make sure that the company remains competitive. And there, I would say that there are at least two things that I look at. Actually, if you break it down, it's actually 4 or 5 things. The first is to make sure that the organization would have the right strategy, accompanied by the correct KPIs, key performance indicators, as well as making sure that there is the correct and appropriate compensation and punishment systems. Now, as far as strategy is concerned, a lot of times in many boards, they would just kind of talk about it in regular board meetings. But I would say that it's very important for especially the large organizations where they have a lot of routine things to clear in the board meetings, to have specific session that would allow the directors to talk about and kind of so-called shoot the breeze on strategy. Because many a times when the boards are too engaged in the day-to-day, or should I say the more mundane issues, the directors may not have the time, or the board as a whole would not have the time to really think what the organizations should do in the very long term. And as we all know, the world is changing so fast. It is important for the leaders of the organization, including the board, to be able to see around the corner, to see what is going on, and then lead the organization going forward. So strategy is very important. But just as important as strategies and corporate cultures and that kind of thing, it is important to make sure that you have the correct KPIs, particularly for financial institutions and for actually many organizations, to have the right KPIs to measure the risks. I believe when I first joined the board of a large bank, they were kind of talking about risks with rims and rims of paper, and I demanded that, can we summarize all risks into one report, and hopefully in less than 10 pages. It really threw them into panic. And I remember, because at that point of time I did have a bit more time, I actually have to draw out all the tables that I wish, defining the content of each kind of row and column. And hopefully it would help them. The reason why I say it's important is if we demonstrate to the leaders of that organization, particularly then cascade down to the middle managers, what the directors will look at, it will actually influence the behavior. I always remember that as seniors or as boards of directors, we somehow would use the signal effect. We would tell the management what we wish to look at. Obviously, we receive those reports, how much time we actually discuss and debate on the report is actually not as important. The fact that we said we would look at those things would send a very strong signal that they would hopefully do the right thing before they actually do the report to us. So having the right KPIs is very important, but then it's just as important to have the appropriate compensation packages and also the penalty. Alignment of interest with the shareholder would be important, but having the right penalty is important too. Even up to today, many kind of financial institutions in China, I believe, are not pursuing wrongdoings of their staff severe enough, because a lot of times they are being measured by their supervisory bodies on how many kind of cases of wrongdoing, meaning the more wrongdoings you have, then obviously you will be rated lower by those regulatory bodies. So as a result, for some organizations, they actually would like to not report some of those bad things. And if that's the case, we may actually be sending a wrong message to the organization that you can actually do strange things without being pursued. And so as a director, particularly yours truly, I sometimes actually would be very harsh on the management for not doing those things. But it's not just setting the strategy, having the right KPIs, and also compensation. You have to make sure that the three sets of these things would be aligned. I mean, just take the case of a bank. I mean, if you look at the mission statements of the bank, you just kind of look at their websites. Many times you see that the banks will say that we would like to be a leading financial institution, providing the best service to the customer. Hopefully, I mean, obviously, in the end, they said, well, we will be the world's #1 or something like that. But then if you look at the KPIs, particularly not so much at the senior, but at the middle level, usually they will have an annual budget that would measure how much deposit you have somehow gathered, how much loans you have made, how much money you have made for the quarter, or at best is the amount of loan losses. But contrast with what you see on the website that you would like to be the world's leading financial institution providing the best customer service. In those KPIs, in those annual budget, there's nothing mentioned about customer service. And worse, even if you say we want to provide good customer service, how do you measure it? There's nothing quantitative. How do you compare your service level between now and, say, 1 year ago? So that is already a mismatch. And then there's yet another mismatch. I mean, so you have all these KPIs that may not be relevant to what you say as your strategy. In some of these organizations, promotions and also the setting of the bonus and salaries has nothing to do with even how much money you make. You know, it's probably recommended by yet another organization that is looking at things that are not quite so-called determined by the KPIs. So when you have a mismatch of strategy or non-alignment of strategy, KPIs, and compensation, how do you really manage? And how do you create a culture that is so-called meritocracy? So as a director, I would actually pay a lot of attention on making sure you have the right strategy, you have the appropriate KPIs that actually measures whatever you say on the strategy, including customer service, including obviously risk management, and including nurturing the right culture. And then have a compensation and a penalty system that actually follows the KPI. And when you have an alignment of these three, strategy, KPIs, and compensation, then chances are the organization will be much better managed and you can move forward. So that is something that I see, at least in many organizations. They all say the right thing, but then it's not followed by the KPIs and compensation. And that, to me, is important. But then as a director, having the right people is one of the most important, if not the most important issue in managing any organization. As you read in some of the management books, many times is first who, then how. If you've got the right people, even though you may not have the best process, you can still move forward. If you have the wrong people, even you have the best KPIs, the best processes, things can still not go forward. Particularly for startups, the boards of startups, probably the most important thing is choosing the right CEO and changing the CEO at the right time. Because as we all know, for startups, the person that starts a business may have the kind of brilliant idea on designing the product or service, but that person may not be able to kind of manage an organization. And also when you grow an organization, the demand on the CEO changes. And too often, the mistake of kind of many startups, and to that extent actually when I was doing private equity, the mistake of many large organizations when they get into trouble is too late to change the CEO. So as a board, kind of making sure that you have the right CEO and also the right key people is one of the most important things of the board. And that is something that I cannot emphasize more. So it's first who then how, and one of the biggest mistakes that I've learned is too late in changing CEOs. Now talking about people, I've also observed in many boards that many boards may not have the right people to serve on the boards. I mean, obviously in many organizations, they invite boards according to the desire of the CEO, and they invite sometimes a lot of people that have great credentials. But those people may be very good in their own field, but some of them are actually not very creative. It is important because we are talking about fulfilling fiduciary duty as well as leading the organization going forward. I think it is important to have people that are not just experienced in their own field, but be able to think laterally, critically, independently. And that, I find, is very important. It is also important for the organization to provide enough training to the directors, first to obviously understand the organization, but also understand what's going on in the industry. And also, the organization should do whatever it means to help nurture a thinking and learning organization, including a thinking and learning board. So there should be means to really expose the board to things that are not immediately related to the organization. But what's going on in, say, technology? What's going on in the world? What is the difference between the millennials and the, say, baby boomers in the way of working, in the way of living, in the way of, say, socializing? Because the millennials, whether we like it or not, will be the largest block of purchasers. I think by the end of the year, millennials would comprise more than half of the world's working force. And we baby boomers, I mean, obviously most of you are not because we are older, baby boomers and millennials have very different behavior. And obviously, pretty soon we will be looking at the Generation Zs, those that are born after the year 2000. So it is important for the organization to help make sure that the directors are appropriate and are learning and thinking all the time. One last point. As I said, I first joined a kind of interesting and significant board 30 years ago when I was in the early 30s. I was blessed, so I have a relatively long history of serving on interesting boards. But I think it is also important for many organizations to appoint younger people into the boards. As I said earlier, the millennials are different, but whether we like it or not, they will be kind of the bulk of the consumers as well as the bulk of the world's population. So it is important to have young people represented in the board so that they can tell us what is going on among their friends. It is also more important to develop these young talents so that over time they can become more seasoned and can help the organization. And it's not just in boards. I hope that in Hong Kong, everybody, including the government, can actually appoint more young people into meaningful positions, because after all, the world is theirs. Thank you.
The second speaker is Mr. Nicholas Charles Allen, chairman of Link Asset Management Limited. He too was asked to comment on the type of role that directors should play. In addition to guard dogs, police dogs, and lap dogs, Mr. Allen came up with a new type of dog.
I appreciate the opportunity to come this morning and make some remarks myself about whether directors are guard dogs, police dogs, or lap dogs. I think just like Anthony, I went to Google when I was given that brief, and I looked up and thought I'd have a look at what sort of dogs we were being asked to compare ourselves with. One of the important things that I was told, Nick, is that if Link REIT are paying you a salary to be chairman, please plug them whenever you can. So I've put a guide dog up there because Link are the sponsors of the Guide Dogs for the Blind as one of their serious charities in Hong Kong. But these were the possible opportunities that I have. On the serious side, it actually was a very interesting challenge to me to be asked to make some remarks on this question, because the other day somebody had to fill out an application form and they had to write down what my job was, and they wrote down professional director. And sometimes you feel that that's a bit of a put down of you, and that you come to a board with other skills and expertise, and that you're not a professional director. But I actually feel it very important to be a professional director. I think one of the things that will come out of today is that we have a very limited pool of professional directors in Hong Kong. I look out to this group and I would expect to see people joining that pool of professional directors. So I've looked at this question from my own point of view as whether I, in the professional director role that I play, should be which of those dogs I should be. And I look at it from the point of view as where am I able to constructively challenge management? If I'm not able to constructively challenge management, then I should be the little gentleman with the bow on his head there. But areas where I am able to constructively challenge and support management would put me into one of the other categories. And when I thought about it a little bit more, I realized that from my own point of view, I should split it into 4 categories. So I'm a professional accountant by background. I ran a large professional services business. I ran the assurance practice at PwC. I had a number of clients. And so I feel that my expertise is in financial areas, and my expertise, having sat on a number of boards for the last 7 or 8 years, is in corporate governance. And so I feel that I am able to constructively challenge in those first 2 areas of financial reporting and corporate governance. But joining a board and to be a professional director, it's not merely being able to do the expertise that you bring to the board, it is how you develop your ability to constructively challenge outside of that area. And so the challenge for me has always been how am I able to constructively challenge outside my areas of expertise. And I put those down really into business operations and into strategic vision. I'm not an expert on utilities. I sit on CLP's board. People that know a lot more about utilities and energy policy sit on that board than me. That doesn't mean that I have to stay silent when we have discussions about business operations. It's incumbent upon me to learn about that area. When I sit on the Lenovo board, there are gurus of software and hardware, and the challenge again is how am I able to function as a proper director on that board? I sit on real estate boards. Unfortunately, I think everybody in Hong Kong feels that they're an expert on real estate, so you get a lot of questions on real estate from board members. But again, really a challenge about expertise. So being asked to make remarks in this area was a really good challenge for me, and I gave it some careful thought. And I really came out with the view that it depends on the sources of information that you have as a director and what you do as a director that enable you to constructively challenge, and so to be one of those dogs. And I put up really 4 areas that I wanted to talk about. Board papers and presentations. Anthony mentioned that you often get voluminous papers the day before board meetings, and that's one area. The second one for me is that director interaction doesn't stop there. It's very important to look at one-on-one interaction. It's very important to visit your businesses, and it's very important to go to industry-specific events. And I'd just like to talk about those in turn. So again, if I look at board papers, a constant complaint that I don't make, but other board members make, is just the volume of papers that you get. You'll get 700 or 800 documents before a board meeting. Now, that's a very, very rich source of information for you as a director to be making decisions and participating in board meetings. But you do have to remember that they are prepared by management. The CEOs that I deal with, I know, spend a great deal of time managing their boards, making sure that their boards get the information in just the right way that they want them to get that information. And so it is a very important source of information by board members, but to just simply rely on that information is not, for me, giving you the ability to triangulate and to learn more about the business than you would do from looking at other areas. And so, in addition to board papers, for me what's very important is one-on-one interaction outside of the other directors. So it is meeting with and talking to other management members that aren't necessarily on the ExCom or aren't necessarily attending the board meetings. And speaking to an audience of chartered secretaries today, I would be encouraging you in those roles to facilitate that interaction on the behalf of boards. I find that some boards are better than others. Sometimes I have to make that initiative and I have to come up with a plan to say, who am I going to speak to this quarter, rather than just attend the board meetings. And when you're busy, it's not always able to do that. But it is important to be able to go out and do that. So I do make a plea that you have some program to try and facilitate that. And I think that CEOs and CFOs should be brave enough to allow you to go and have those conversations outside of the information that they control when they provide information to the board meeting. And then thirdly, depending on the nature of the industry, please visit assets and businesses and speak to the people there. That is not what people describe as corporate tourism. Great, we've opened a shop in Paris. I think it's time I went to have a look at it. That's not what I'm talking about. It really has to be a genuine desire to go and look at properties. I've just joined the board of Link. We've got 175 properties in Hong Kong. The outgoing chairman said to me, I try and visit one every week, Nick. It took me 2.5 years. So I'm in the middle of that program. That's just one end of the spectrum of giving an example about trying to go and visit the assets that you have and talk to people at those assets, and again have a different triangulation of information that you might get at the board papers and that you might get from your one-on-one, and that you go and look at those assets. And then fourthly, attending industry and related conferences. And again, you need to be selective. And I encourage the corporate secretarial world to look at this and to facilitate sensible approaches. Lenovo have a stall at the Las Vegas Electronics Show every January. And you get an invitation to go to that, and wow, I'll go to Las Vegas for the week. I tend not to go to that week. It's lots of newfangled electronic stuff, but there are some other very good programs that you go to. There's a big Mobile World Conference in Barcelona, which tells you all about what's happening in mobile telephony and how it's being used, the Internet of Things, etc. But those are the sorts of things that I feel directors should be encouraged to attend, to enable them to round out their knowledge and therefore be able to ask sensible questions. You won't end up being the industry expert on the board, but you will be able to participate and challenge and ensure processes in place so that strategies are properly reached. And so, just in summary, when asked to make remarks about guard dogs, police dogs, lap dogs, and the guide dog that I introduced as the extra dog, for me, you will be a different dog today depending on the skill sets that you bring into the board. If you bring in industry knowledge, then you'll be a guard dog in that area, but you have to work quite hard to improve the nature of your ability to constructively challenge when it's outside your area of expertise. So my final plea is please try and facilitate that. If it's left to me, it's a little bit haphazard. I try and do it. I try and have a program. But if it's facilitated, then it really does enrich the director skill set and the professionalism of the directors that sit on your boards. So thank you very much.